we're going to get started. It doesn't sound like, it sounds like, there's a little bit of a crowd outside, so let us know if you guys can't hear us. We're going to present on something called the Unheard Voices. We're really talking about remediation across specialties, and then also about strategies going forward. I'm Bonnie Kaplan. I'm the program director for the Denver Health Residency in Emergency Medicine.
And I'm Sarah Krasaniak. I am the program director for the EM program at Stanford. So before we get started, I just want to acknowledge three people that were an important part of a paper that we published that helped to inform the content of this talk. So these three individuals were our co-authors on this paper that we published last year. I'll provide the reference, but Daniela Lucas, Elizabeth Bradley, Stephen Wolf were all a big part of the project.
So why are we talking about this? Remediation is extremely important, as many of you in the room may or may not have realized, or know, or have experienced, right? This is about residents making progress and meeting milestones and making accomplishments that set them up for success, not just in residency, but in their career. We know a lot from the remediators' standpoint in the literature, but we didn't know a lot from actually those being remediated. And so a lot of this background was used to inform what next steps are, what's out there, and how we can improve.
So several years ago, we did a project looking at the resident perspectives on remediation. This is a part of the literature that really has been lacking. And so we conducted focus groups at 3 different institutions. We had 68 different residents from 12 different specialties represented. And we looked at the analysis from the focus groups to see what the common themes were and to look at what our residents were actually feeling about remediation process. So there were really 3 big ideas that came out of this, but the overarching theme was that there was this need for change and that there's a negative culture around remediation. And so we wanted to look at what was feeding this negative culture, and then what can we do to help fix this. So 3 big parts of this are lack of transparency, negative stigma, and overwhelming emotions. So in the lack of transparency, it goes in a couple different ways. The first is that we're really lacking in our feedback, and that residents don't always know when they are struggling. With this quote, basically you assume that no news is good news. But there's also a lack of transparency about the process for remediation. So what does it mean to remediate? When do you start remediation? What are the implications? And it's this really vague process that is scary for residents. The second is that we have a negative stigma around remediation. It's seen as a dirty word. People don't want to talk about it because it's seen as something shameful. And then finally, that there are a lot of overwhelming emotions that come along with being remediated. Our participants recognize that remediation can be really career altering, and that if you are remediated and you don't progress remediation, you might have to change your career, and that really has a heavy implication, especially for our residents, and we'll talk about their role in the remediation process, but really looking at what those emotions are. So we used this data to look at what are some strategies that we could use moving forward in the remediation processes that we are going through to help us be more successful and potentially alleviate some of the concerns from our residents.
So we're going to talk about 6 strategies and give you examples about what this looks like to how to set yourself and your residents up for success if they need help in remediation. So the first one is setting clear expectations. We're going to talk a little about clear communication, specifically on the individual level and then outward from that individual. We're going to talk about adopting a culture of feedback, forming an alliance with residents that are being remediated, building a network of support, and incorporating peer feedback.
So the first strategy is setting expectations early, and there's really 2 parts of this. The first is setting the expectation early that we expect our residents to struggle in the process of their training. I think it's really hard for residents who are high-performing residents to come in and to hear this constructive feedback and to not have it be a personal affront or an attack on their characteristics or their inherent ability to be a good physician. So setting the expectation early that we're going to be finding areas for improvement for you throughout your entire training, that we're going to be looking for gaps, and then really trying to embrace that growth mindset to say these are opportunities. These aren't a reflection on who you are or the kind of doctor you can be, but really just a way for us to help you grow, and that's a part of the residency training. The second expectation that's really important to set early is, what does it look like to struggle in residency? What does it mean to be on remediation? What does it mean to be on probation? We have an infographic that we show all of our interns during orientation to show them exactly how you enter the process, how do you exit the process, at what point are you, moving from probation to remediation, so that it's really clear when they start that process what the next steps are.
So that's the broader communication that we often talk about. We're going to also talk about clear communication on the individual level, right? How do we set that individual up for success, not just internally, but also externally as well? The quote up here is, and the quotes that you'll see are representative quotes from our paper of perspectives from residents across specialties. And so for this one, this perception of people on remediation is a negative thing overall. People don't talk about it. It's like, how we can't talk about that. You don't want them to get embarrassed, and then you don't know the personal struggle. So in mind, for that individual, it's really important to set up, again, clear and frequent communication with that individual that's struggling, so they know exactly the next steps, what it looks like for them as well as for others in that process. We also often recommend they reach out to their peers if they feel comfortable. This can be a very isolating experience, and we don't want it to be that. We all struggle, and so we often tell them to reach out to gain support and actually gain advice and guidance that really can set them up for success. We also try to encourage our residents to reach out to their attendings that they're working with, right? Be very clear and objective about the themes that they're working on. Set their shifts up for success. Tell them they're working on communication and translation of medical knowledge, and then they can give really directed feedback. It actually makes them more engaged in this process, and it helps the attendings focus and empower and set those residents up for success. The third option that we have done is actually have, as residency leadership, reach out to attendings. I think I always put this in sort of a cautious box, because you don't want to bias people against someone inappropriately. I'm seeing some nods, of course, in the audience about that. So what we do is we engage the resident in that process. We make sure that they're comfortable with that. We make sure the language is very objective and clear, and we make sure that the resident has a copy and helped us come up with those tips and tricks for those attendings. So again, their shifts can be set up for success, their feedback can be directed to their success, and we can empower the resident in the process. Another piece that's really important is adopting this feedback of culture. This is critical to your success, and if you don't feel like your place has it, we're going to give a couple examples of how you can make this happen, or even, hopefully, even if you feel like you have it, but how you can strengthen that culture of feedback that you already know exists. So really important is a psychologically safe learning environment. People need to feel empowered to bring up concerns or questions, and understand that this is part of the process and feel really safe in bringing up those concerns. The second is this growth mindset. Again, how I said before, we all struggle, and it's really important to understand that it takes hard work and perseverance really to get to that next step and empower you to get to that next step, and making sure that's part of how your process and your culture work. And then making it part of what you do. So an example of how to do that is at our shop, we do a pre-shift huddle with our evaluation that has an objective component and then a subjective component that the residents actually can add to. That happens before your shift. They know exactly what they're going to be evaluated on. They see the evaluation. They can bring in their feedback that they have. And then after shift, you do the same thing. You talk to them about their evaluation. You go through it with them, and you type in your comments at that post-shift huddle. The other thing that I think is really important is, again, what we do are two things. One, how we phrase it. So we talk to our residents a lot post-shift about what went well and then what could go better yet. We completely stole that from the lean process, but we really liked that phrasing of how to be thoughtful, proactive, and productive. The final piece is engaging yourself in this. Again, if this is the culture of what we do and how we do it, we always say to our residents, hey, what went well for you and what could go better yet, and what went well for me and what could I do better yet next time. So this is just the process in a circular fashion that we all do, and then we get real-time feedback on both sides of the coin.
All right, so the next strategy is forming an alliance with your resident. So there's a couple different ways that you can accomplish this. The first is we really try hard to avoid the us versus you phenomenon. For anyone that's been, either on remediation or even struggled in training, can feel very isolating, and it can feel very much like the world is against you and people are out to get you. Even that evaluation process, the assessment process, can feel almost like an attack, and every time you get it, you're living through this. So forming that alliance by avoiding the us versus you, saying we're in this together, and You just gotta kick it real hard, Ash. There you go. Yeah, you're fine. So avoiding that us versus you phenomenon. The literature actually shows us that we can further stigma with our language, and so depending on the local culture at your institution, thinking about what are the words that we're using to describe these residents who need extra help. Is it, struggling residents? Words that can be really challenging are like incompetence or deficient. Those are words that can actually widen that gap and further the stigma around it. So I will then let Bonnie talk to you about the network of support that's necessary after you form this initial alliance.
So it's really important, as I said before, that this can be a very isolating process, and so really surrounding each person that's experiencing remediation by a network of support. So we usually pick a point person. For us, it tends to be in residency leadership, where they're meeting frequently, have clear communication, have clear building blocks for success. In addition, we have the resident engage in picking a success team. So they pick faculty members specifically in our department that they feel are supportive and help empower them, and also give them really thoughtful, constructive feedback. We come together and agree on who those faculty will be, and then we build this network of support, and that success team also meets with them very frequently. It's also important, right, in your department to think about outside your department and building that network of support. That could be family, that could be friends, that could be people in other residency programs. And it's important, we tell them to reach out to make sure that they're having those conversations and not feeling so isolated. The final thing that we've just incorporated over the last year is we brought on a social worker, and so they act as in the form of a coach. This has been really great to hit some of those gray areas that often go hand in hand with when you're going through struggles in residency. So there's financial stressors, there's family stressors, there's lived experience stressors that of course come into play when you're thinking about this. There's how to be a good mentee, there's how to ask for support and help, and that social worker who is acting in that piece as a coach has been really instrumental in setting them up for success.
So the final strategy is to incorporate peer feedback. This actually came out really predominantly in our study, where our participants said they want to be a part of this process, especially on specialties that have rounding and week-long teams. The residents commented, we actually know when our peers are struggling before the faculty does, and we spend more time with our peers. And certainly in EM, we see that as well. In our graduated responsibility model, we have senior residents that supervise junior residents, and they're often the first ones to raise the alarm for us or tell us, look, I think this person is missing something. The problem is that our residents also stated in this research project that they don't have the training or the space to provide this feedback. So they want to provide the feedback, but they said they don't know how. They're not given the training to know how to give feedback. And they also don't have a place to do it, a dedicated time, a dedicated space. They said it felt uncomfortable to do it more on the fly, and really wanting that space to do it. At Stanford, we have an anonymous peer feedback process. It's honestly, we've had some challenges getting it off the ground because I think the culture is still not there. But some of the things that we've done to try to help this is it's anonymous and the comments are batched. So residents will get their peer feedback delivered to them on a quarterly basis, not just when that feedback comes in. We review it to make sure there's not something urgent that needs to be addressed. But it provides a little bit of space between it. It is still, though, it's hard to build this into the culture, that part of the culture, right? Because we talked about that gravity of identifying that someone is struggling and all of the implications that go along with it, and the peers don't want to call out their colleague. So we're really trying to continue to build this culture that this is part of it, and identifying gaps helps us to provide that support.
So we talked about these 6 strategies: set expectations early, clear communication, adopting a culture of feedback, forming an alliance, build a network of support, and incorporate peer feedback. We're going to do just one case to talk about how we'll do that and move forward. So this is the case. Some of you may have had something similar, but I will read it out loud. Numerous faculty reach out to you about a resident. Their concerns is the histories this resident gets are different than what they obtain from the patient. In addition, direct observation reveals this resident struggles with taking organized and productive histories. This resident has done well on exams, however, seems to struggle in the clinical setting. So I'm going to take if this is the first time we're really getting this batched feedback, and the resident hasn't received the feedback yet. Strategies for this, again, would be meeting with this resident with this batched feedback to sit down in a safe psychologically safe environment to go over this feedback in a structured form, engage them in what that feedback is, try to gain from them where their perspective is coming from and why they think this is the perception of what's going on, and then set up a strategy and a plan for success. Sarah, what would you do if this was a repeat issue?
Yeah, I think the main difference, right, is if this is the first time the resident is hearing it or this is a subsequent time that the resident is hearing it. And I think this is really where, again, we use the infographic visual that we have for our remediation process really comes into play, because on that infographic we have, what would happen with Bonnie's situation is that we sit down, we have this conversation, but the next step from that is that if we hear another concern and it continues to be a problem, then we enter this letter of warning phase, which then goes into remediation, which then goes into probation. And each of those have an off-ramp to say, this is how we move on past this point. But really demonstrating, we've heard this now, we've addressed this with you, we're still seeing these continued concerns, we're worried about your ability to progress to this next year. So we're gonna, form an alliance with you to help you get through this and to help find a way that we can work to close this gap so that we can catch you up with your peers.
Set up for success.
So with that, we will wrap up. I hope that this reinforces that there's a need for change in how we are approaching residents who struggle during their training. The strategies for success, you can take one or all, try to incorporate them into the processes that you have at your institution. And then again, I think future directions really, for me at least, are around the peer feedback part and how do we ingrain that in our residents to be an active participant in that process, both for themselves and for their colleagues.
I don't know if we have time for questions, but thank you for being here and thank you for listening, and we're happy to answer any questions in these last couple minutes.
Question. So you talked about particular words, so competence and efficiency have more negative connotations. So struggling seems like better. Are there other words or?
Yeah, it's a great question. Interestingly, some of the papers actually use the term discompetence, like DYS competence, which I don't know. I think that we are using more language around competency and competence, so that might be one way, but I still feel like I think it really depends on the individual and the local culture. One of the papers talked about in Australia there were certain connotations with some words, so I think it's a little bit institution dependent. But there's no way you can't sugarcoat everything at some point. So to your point, at some point you have to say you're struggling. It's funny because as we talked about the words and we talked about this talk, I said, I always say struggling resident. I always use that. And maybe that's not the best term to use. I think, a resident with challenges or having challenges. I don't know, what do you?
Yeah, we struggle with this too. I think we've tried to adopt some of the having not met a competency yet, so it's more objective. So still working on meeting is a way of doing it versus, and then meets and then exceeds, and then trying to keep that from the objective piece. I will tell you that one of my incredible APDs came up with some of that wording, and it's based off of the Lean Six Sigma model. So again, that's the whole thought about what do we do well and what do we do better yet, and so trying to keep that proactive and objective. But I don't have any other ideas besides that.
So one thing I struggle with remediating residents is how much is too much with respect to how we support them versus how much they come up with their own individualized learning plans. Because a lot of what I kind of mentioned to them is after these three or 4 years, whatever type of program you're at, afterwards, unfortunately, there's going to be no one there who's going to be able to assist them in the process. And so I wonder how much of your remediation process involves them actively creating their own plans and their own next steps for their remediation.
That's a great question. Do you want to take that?
Yeah, we struggle with the same thing. I mean, I'm not saying that we have anything magical about it. I will say that our social worker who's a coach actually talks a lot about that, right? So you need to be proactive in your process. This is how to be a good mentee. This is how to get the feedback that you need and want. This is how do you ask for stuff. So they do a lot of career coaching, personal development coaching, and professionalism coaching actually in those sessions. And subjectively, that's where I've seen the best results.
And is the social worker through GME or is it
It is now through GME. We did a pilot through our department, and now it's through our GME, and it's going to be spread across from that. And we have a really incredible place that's willing to support that. So,
I'll just quickly add, I think providing the scaffold for what that remediation plan should look like is really important. And then allowing them to almost like choose your own adventure. Like, here's the problem that we're facing, and here are some ways that we think you could address this, and which one of these seems like the way that would best align with, you know, what's valuable. But getting that, you know, co-creation and the buy-in, I think, is really important, and it's hard. Because we know that our learners aren't great self-assessors, and they're also not great at fixing those problems. Stephen?
I was going to say, I'm intrigued by the transparency and the clear communication of using an infographic to set up the expectations ahead of time. I actually have used somewhat of a flow chart for faculty in the same manner, and what it's served me well with is just helping people understand the or how the process is going to go on the repeat. Right? Be like, remember, we were here and now we're here. And it rather than that automatic defense mechanism of no one's ever told me, or I didn't know I was so far down the process, or and so like kudos to you. I'd love to see that.
I'm happy to share with you.
I have a question regarding that part too. So you say you talk about this during intern orientation. So I'm thinking to myself, how am I going to do this without showing rather than being like, oh, this is really up to
Yeah,
way to start
for sure.
this whole situation. So how do you approach it in a way that still lay out like this is the real deal of how it works, without them being like on their first shift being like, oh my gosh, I did something wrong, I'm gonna be on this ladder or whatever.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's something that we've tried to be really thoughtful about. So the two things I'll say is, you know, we set it up in that conversation of everybody's going to struggle. We expect that all of you are going to have trouble with something. And then I will usually segue with, like, some people will struggle more than others. And when you get to that point, this is the pathway that you'll go into. It's also looped into part of our policies and procedures, so it feels less like this is the talk about how you're going to fail. Like, it's this talk about, like, here's all of our procedures and policies, and one of the policies we have is about remediation. So it gets lumped into there. But it is a tough balance when they're already feeling like overwhelmed and like a ton of imposter syndrome, that they come in and we're like, and this is what happens. But really trying to normalize. I mean, there's a lot of literature out there that says we need to normalize remediation, like maybe even have like universal remediation, like everybody remediates something in their career. And so normalizing this process is something that we all like embrace and accept as part of the training.
I think the other thing is we have meetings with our APDs that first year too, just because we do the same thing. We do policies and procedures, both intern orientation, and then we do it again for the residents every July. And then on their first meetings with their intern associate program director, we stress the same thing. And then sometimes we'll bring in how, you know, we too have struggled, right? So we just make it examples of you know, we've all been there. I usually use the example, I was like, I'm not good at taking tests. And so this is what happens, and then it can normalize it from that perspective.
Okay, we want to get you guys onto your 5:30s or the reception. Thank you guys.